evening and welcome to Hardfire. I'm Scott Morgan of the Queens Libertarian Party and the state committee man for the New York Independence Party. My special guest today is CATHY Stewart, who is chairperson of the Manhattan Independence Party, and I believe he has something to do with Quip. Riding shotgun, as it were, Joseph Dobrian, whose official title, I believe, is Secretary of the Libertarian Party.
That's right.
And our topic tonight is supercapitalism, based on a series of lectures that Cathy does. Briefly like to read something just to introduce the concept of supercapitalism. This is from the New York Review of Books. It's called The Wrecking Ball of Innovation by Tony Jute. Reich's theme goes as follows: during what he called the not quite golden age of American capitalism, from the end of World War II through the 1970s, American economic life was stable and in comfortable equilibrium. A limited number of giant firms like General Motors dominated their predictable and secure markets. Skilled workers had steady and relatively safe jobs. For all the lip service paid to competition and free markets, the American economy, in this respect comparable to the economies of Western Europe, depended heavily upon protection from foreign competition, as well as standardization, regulation, subsidies, price supports, and government guarantees. The natural iniquities of capitalism was softened by the assurance of present well-being and future prosperity and a widespread sentiment, however illusory, of common interest. While Europeans set up cartels and fussed with democratic socialism, America went right to the heart of the matter, creating democratic capitalism as a planned economy run by business. But since the mid-'70s, and with increasing ferocity in recent years, the winds of change, supercapitalism, have blown all that away. Thanks to technologies initially supported or spun off from Cold War research projects, such as computers, fiber optics, satellites, and the Internet, commodities, communication, and information now travel at a vastly accelerated pace. Regulatory structures set in place over the course of a century or more were superseded or dismantled within a few years. In their place came increased competition both for global markets and for the cataract of international funds chasing lucrative investments. Wages and prices were driven down, profits up. Competition and innovation generated new opportunities for some and vast pools of wealth for a few. Meanwhile, they destroyed jobs, bankrupted firms, and impoverished communities. So, Cathy, what's wrong with that analysis?
Well, I think that, let me start by just sharing where the term supercapitalism comes from. Robert Reich, who's a former Secretary of Labor during the Clinton years, wrote a book that came out last fall called Supercapitalism, and he traces, this is his analysis of the development of the economy in the United States and the impact of globalization. One thing that I found very interesting in his analysis is the complementary growth of the industry and industries and capitalism becoming a huge lobbying force in Washington, D.C. And he traces that in a lot of detail, and I think it's very fascinating. His analysis is that supercapitalism has overwhelmed the democratic institutions of our country, and some examples of that, of what that looks like, and then we could kind of pick that apart, because I think he misses a couple of very, very key things. But if you look at the growth of lobbying, the growth of corporate lobbying from the 1950s to the 1990s was extraordinary. In the 1950s, less than 100 companies had any kind of presence in Washington, D.C. By the 1990s, more than 500 companies had regular lobbying operations with over 61,000 lobbyists in their employ. And this began a whole cycle of a huge flow of corporate money into the bipartisan coffers. Both parties received contributions in increasing amounts. The other phenomenon to occur is a whole revolving door phenomenon where your likely career choice after leaving Congress or the Senate was to become a lobbyist. And so, for example, 30% of retiring congressmen became lobbyists in 2005. Rather extraordinary. Between 1998 and 2004, 2,200 high-ranking federal officials registered as lobbyists. So you begin to see a very, very close relationship here. What were corporations lobbying about? And I think this is very interesting because I think a lot, as voters and taxpayers, we aren't as clued into what this looks like, and I think Reich does a nice job of describing it. But when you have an economic environment that's increasingly competitive, which is one of the results of the increased technology, the ease of mobility, and the growth of the global economy, any seemingly neutral law or regulation can create corporate winners and losers. Literally, how does the word organic get defined? It makes a big difference to Cascade Farms and to Kraft Foods, and they spend enormous amount of time and energy lobbying around those kinds of issues. So I think that's an important component of Reich's analysis, which is that the problem that we face, or one problem, is that supercapitalism has overwhelmed the capacity of average voters to impact on public policy. Now, his solution is to create more of a wall between corporations and our democratic institutions through regulations, etc. Of course, the problem in that is that it leaves out that the whole matrix of our electoral process is run and constructed by the two major parties.
It's a good time to get Joseph in.
Exactly, and I would agree with a lot of what Cathy has just said, except that I would take issue with the premise that she started with. Now, something certainly has been overwhelmed or undermined by globalization, but I would say it's not our democratic institutions, as she calls them. Rather, it is the rights of the individual that have been overwhelmed and undermined by globalization. And we can't say that this is just because of big bad capitalism. I think it has more to do with improved communications, improved logistics, all of which will assist various powerful and wealthy entities, whether individuals or corporations, to in working together and enriching one another. I would say, though, that there's probably not a practical solution, certainly not one that could be implemented quickly, but if there is one, I think that it must come from the growth of individual liberty rather than the growth of democracy, which, in my opinion, militates against liberty to a great degree.
So how would you define the relationship between capitalism and democracy?
Oh, I would say that probably they're very closely related. In any democratic situation, the mob can be easily manipulated. That's the whole point of a democratic system. If you've got the gift of the gab, you can convince the mob that 2 and 2 make 5 and pass legislation to that effect. A large global entity with a great deal of capability in communications and so forth at its disposal will be able to so convince the mob and thus enforce its will.
Okay, a question for both of you, though.
Okay, good. And then I got to come back to talk about the mob.
Of course. But you were talking about lobbying. Now, how much of this is for, quote, American companies, and how much is from, multinationals?
Well, I think the definition of an American company and a multinational is really breaking down. Most of your large American companies are now functioning at a multinational level. So that's a big issue.
That's not new,
the
though.
economy.
That's been going on for many, many years.
Exactly. See, I think what's so interesting about the differing perspectives here is that I believe in the mob. I really do. And I think our country was founded on some very basic principles that we were going to try to construct an experiment, a democracy in which the majority of Americans could build. Let me finish before you can correct me after I'm done. But where there was going to be a process. Yes, it was representative. But it never was a process that envisioned two major parties becoming monopolies. And that's what's happened. And it's perverted what I think is very fundamental to the American experiment, which is trying to find a way for a country of our size to have a mechanism and a process in which the American people can decide what are the rules that should govern.
This country was never founded on popular rule. It was not founded on the principles of democracy. It was not intended to be, by our founding fathers, a democracy where people have only privileges. No. It was supposed to be a republic where people have rights. But since then, it has been corrupted
which the mob
into a democracy.
Which the mob had to enforce by force, obviously. That's what they called the American Revolution.
That was hardly the mob. That was...
oh, yeah, right.
No, that was about 20% who felt one way, 20% who felt the other way, and 60% who couldn't really care less.
I could make a good-sized mob at 20% of the population.
Indeed, you could.
Right,
Indeed,
but I think what's important, Joseph, and I think we were speaking before the show started today about this difference in how we view things. I think that our country was founded on basic democratic principles, and I agree with
Well,
you
I
on
disagree.
rights. But can I just say one thing about rights? One of the rights that the American people are supposed to have is the right to change our government, the right to elect people who will follow our desires and issues and carry out public policy in the interests of the American
right
people.
to change
And
our
that
government,
right's
yes.
been eroded.
The right to change our government, yes,
Yes.
and that right has been eroded. I entirely
Yes.
agree with you on that point. However, we have never had the right, we never should have had the right to take ownership of other individuals. It seems to me that the crucial difference between you and me is that one of us feels that man has no property in man, and the other one feels that man can and ought to have property in his fellow man. You feel that the mob should own the individual. I say no. The
don't think she said that at
individual
all.
should be protected against the mob.
No, what I think is that the American people have a right to make those decisions.
So
See,
if
I
the-
think in
if
the
the majority
balance,
believed that slavery was proper, then we should allow slavery, for example.
well, if it was a fair democratic vote, I might move out of that country. But if you look at the history of our country, it's actually been a fight around those very issues. And in fact, you could say capitalism's first successful lobbying campaign was around the issue of slavery, and they won. And we had to go through a civil war to
The Civil
change
War
that.
was not fought to abolish slavery, for heaven's sake.
Well, I think that's a complex issue. There were lots of issues in play, and it also was very fundamentally, it certainly evolved into a war to end slavery.
That was what it became after the war had been prosecuted for nearly 3 years. At first, it was
Yes,
a
but
war
that's
to-
something that the
it was a war
American
to keep
people
the Union
made
together.
happen.
It was a war to
Well-
keep the Union together, and certainly if the Union could have been preserved by leaving slavery in place, it would have done.
No, they
Lincoln
tried
himself
that.
said so.
They tried that, and it didn't work.
They tried it and it
You
didn't
could
work,
also-
but Lincoln himself said that he would do it that way. if
He
could.
said he's a politician. He said all kinds of things. But I think one
Also,
of the key
Lincoln
things.
speaks the truth when you want him to speak the truth.
Well,
and he-
no, I think
I wasn't
to
there.
have a fair dialogue about Lincoln, who I think was a very great leader of our country, I think Lincoln was brilliant in his capacity to grow and develop and to take the temperature of what was happening in the country and to respond to what was necessary to keep the Union together and moving forward. So I think his position evolved over time, and I think he responded to a widespread mass movement that had a left, a right, and a center
I
to
totally
abolish
disagree.
slavery.
I totally disagree.
Well-
There was a very large and strong pro-Confederacy movement in the North, particularly here in the state of New York, which was pretty much a pro-Confederacy state, if you want to talk about majorities.
Right, but you could also say that the Civil War was the victory of Northern capitalism over feudalist society.
Well, yes, it
and
probably
the feudalist
was.
society just couldn't stand.
That's probably true. However, Lincoln felt that it was his constitutional duty, which arguably it was, to preserve the Union. This was not a fight to abolish slavery, it was a fight to preserve the Union.
In fact, what I think he recognized was that you could not move forward until you abolished slavery, that it was fundamentally contradictory to the bulk of the founding documents of our country.
Then why did
and-
he proclaim that the slaves were to be freed only in those states that were, in his words, in rebellion against the Union, and not in states that had been subdued, such as Tennessee, or slave states that had not seceded, such as Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and northern part of Missouri?
Yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't complex other issues in play, including the economic issues and the constraints and the growth of industrialization. All of that is true. But at its core, what emerged in the Civil War was a fight over the nature of what this country was going to be, and was it going to be a country that abolished slavery and tried to move forward from
No,
there.
it wasn't
That's what
whether
it
it was a
became.
question of whether we
well,
would abolish
the
slavery. It was a
Republican-
question of whether we would have one nation or two.
All right, time is limited
Yes,
here.
let's go back
let's
to
get it back
today.
to economics. Yeah, I mean the Union is lost. I mean the multinationals, the nation states got 50 years left. This one, that one, all of them. You know, multinationals everywhere, NGOs everywhere.
That may be so, but what's the?
I'm telling
is
you,
that a-
if you don't cut me off in the middle of the paragraph, you know, the caliphate, you know, pan-Islamism, tribalism all over the world, even pop culture.
Okay, what do you propose to do about it?
I'm just lie back and enjoy it. I don't know. But, I mean, one Bob Dylan is worth 1,000 Ralph Naders in terms of, you know, inspiring people to look at things differently. These economic structures shift over time, always will. There's no ideal system.
Okay,
It's
well,
constantly in flux.
you may be right, but is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's neither.
It's just
There's a
our reality.
dialectic.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, I think that what you're saying, Scott, about what we're looking at, if you look at the international situation, for me raises what do we have to do in this country, given the role of the United States internationally? Are we going to create a mass movement? In my opinion, that's an independent movement. It's broad. It includes third-party forces like the Libertarian Party and a mass of the American people that's growing. Now 40% of the electorate consider themselves independent. The numbers for college students, 41%. And in the African-American community, 35% now consider themselves independent. I think that trend, the more you look at it, the more you poll independents, what they're saying is that they've lost confidence that the Democratic and Republican parties can get beyond their partisan bickering and come up with any kind of real solutions to the economy, to the role of the United States internationally, to health care, education, etc. And so increasingly they're looking to become a third force in our own right, independents, that could begin to restructure our democratic process so that the power shifts more towards the American people.
Okay. You're probably right about the disaffection that's being felt by a great many people towards the two major parties. That's nothing new, of course. But I wish somebody would articulate just what the problem is with each of those parties. I mean, I could do it for myself, certainly, and no doubt you could do it for yourself. But I wish that I could...
The three of us have been doing that for a number of years.
Of course, of course. I'm just wishing that I could get a general sense of what these various independents want, and that's probably an impossible proposition because everybody's got vastly differing opinions.
Well, it's a paradigm shift, and no one knows the end line.
A paradigm shift from what to what?
Well, the disaffection from the old two-party system. It's not supported. You have essentially three tepid center-right candidates who don't challenge any of the stuff we're talking about. They just accept it as the way it is. That's how they pay for their campaigns. It's got to be a mass movement or, you know, a cleverly leveraged movement that can become a mass movement.
I think that a lot what independents are looking for is a fundamental restructuring. So I have a sense of this from our work in New York with the growth of the Independence Party, but I think people are very frustrated by the dynamic of seeing these two parties, and they might even agree with positions candidates take, but then you watch what happens in Albany, in the city council,
right,
in Washington, D.C., and it's partisan bickering, and it's putting the interests of the parties ahead of the interests of the country and the American people. So I think people want to see things like open primaries, same-day voter registration, serious open debates that have all qualified candidates participating so we can have a broader civic dialogue and look at broader solutions. I think people want to have more ways as citizens to input, more checks and balances on what our government is doing. That's why I'm a big advocate of initiative and referendum, which I know we probably disagree on. A lot of these issues aren't the sexy issues, but I think increasingly Americans are recognizing that our system of government is broken. It's not responsive to many of the issues that we're facing and that our kids are facing.
And for the last beat.
And we're at a war, and a war the American people don't support. That's a good example.
Yes, well, I think that you and I probably agree on what a lot of the problems are. I think that where we differ is in the process. You feel that the process should be democratized as much as possible,
yes,
and this would inevitably lead to an improvement of the overall system of government. I say just the opposite. I say that the government should be made smaller and less influential, therefore voting would be made less influential, and the less control that each person has over his fellow man, the better.
So why do you oppose INR then, initiative and referendum? Isn't that kind of direct democracy? And
I know it's
a
horrible thing. It's a sickening thing to me. I don't want a bunch of morons, a coalition, if you will, of the ill-informed, the idiotic, and the intoxicated being led to the polls by some snake oil salesman.
So educate them.
Right, exactly.
Oh, they don't want to be educated. They want slogans. They want to...
But see, to go to your point, they need to have, everybody has to have the same rights to shape their government. Whether you're educated or uneducated, rich or poor, you need to have the same access and the same opportunity to shape what happens in your country.
Therefore, government should be made as small as possible so that these various idiots are not able to interfere with my life.
Here's the proposition. How do we get to that referendum
and then I'll live with the results. But right now, government has become synonymous with the two major parties.
So
That's my main complaint
you'll live
about
with
our
the results
government.
of any referendum as long as it's in the majority.
No, what I'm saying is that I will I will go with the American people and build a process, and you'll win some and lose some. But if that process is fair and open and allows for full participation, as an American citizen, I have a right to go along with the outcome because I will have participated in shaping it. Right now, most Americans have no confidence and don't feel that they get to shape it. Look at the incumbency return rate in Albany.
Wait just a second.
98%. The elections aren't competitive.
If you're in the minority, how can you say that you've participated in the system? This is where I come back to my old remark about democracy being just two wolves and a sheep voting on breakfast. How did that sheep get involved in the process except to be eaten by the wolves?
Well, but we have a system that also guarantees certain rights. So
no,
minorities,
we don't, and especially not under
minorities
initiative
in our
and referendum,
country,
there would be no rights whatsoever.
Minorities in our country have, from the African American community to the gay community to the women's movement, that were marginalized, have used the democratic processes and built mass movements to win certain rights. So
Certain privileges, I would say.
Well, I don't consider voting a privilege. It is not a privilege.
Voting is a privilege.
Oh, no.
It can be taken away from you. It can be adjusted at the whim of now the legislature or under your system by a referendum. The right to vote could be taken away, for example, from black people by a vote of the majority.
See,
that makes voting not a right but a privilege.
It's a right guaranteed by the Constitution that was hard
It's not.
fought for.
Look at the Constitution. It does not guarantee the right to vote.
It was an amendment to our Constitution. My point is that the American people create those documents and have to have the capacity to continually shape what democracy is in this country. So you have a position, and I appreciate that, and you should have equal access to the voters, to candidates, to put those positions out there and let the American people decide whether they agree that government should be curtailed back, whether government should provide more services, what our role should be internationally. I think that the power has to come from the American people.
Actually,
otherwise, we end up where we are now with two parties that have restructured American government.
You deceive yourself, though, that the
conflated.
Constitution did not come from the people, not from the masses. No, ma'am. It came from a small constitutional convention of, I believe, fewer than 100 delegates.
And it was ratified by all the states.
It was ratified by state legislatures who were, in many cases, not popularly elected or, at any rate, chosen by a very small electorate. It was hardly a democratic system.
Well, I actually am a big fan of the Articles of Confederation, so you have a point there.
I agree with you.
But it is a living document. It does give us a certain framework and capacity to change. My point is that what we've got to do is to continue to chip away at opening up the process and ending the conflation and the confines of the two major parties.
And that's a good point for me to get this in. Jeremy Rifkin, his concept is hypercapitalism, which essentially states that the commodification of capitalism, of everything under capitalism, will simply erode these rights, whether you like them or not. Once you have one big company, that the government is just basically the lobbyists and the mass media, then what do you have? You don't have a democratic society.
That's probably so.
You don't have a libertarian society.
Of course, that's probably so. But I think that democracy will do just as much damage. I think pretty much
as capitalism.
Yeah,
the commodification of everything is underway.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you.
I think the antidote to that is the long-term process of building a movement. See, what we can't forget is that even as that is all happening, the American people have tremendous creative capacities to come together with all our differences across racial, economic, all kinds of ways that we're taught. Well, for example, I think a very small example of this, but I think that when Mayor Bloomberg was elected in New York City in 2001, and again in 2005, that was a very interesting moment in city politics, because what you saw there was new kinds of electoral coalitions. In his re-election campaign in 2005, 47% of the black community voted for Mayor Bloomberg and 60% of independents. That's a new electoral coalition that's breaking out of the rules that say the African American community, 90% votes Democratic. Independents, well, they're all over the map. They're left, they're right, they're center. There was something new happening on the ground, and I think the appeal of Mayor Bloomberg was that he was not a partisan. He wasn't owned by any political party. We might agree or disagree with what he did in any one instance, but he brought a nonpartisan approach to government. And that's the kind of thing we have to keep building on and keep advancing. New ways of coming together as Americans to vote in ways that exert more political pressure on the two parties.
I agree. He brought a nonpartisan approach. That much, I'll go with you that far. But whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. I mean, good God, his approach is basically do it my way or you're fired. He runs this city like a business, and if you don't like it, get out. He has no respect for individual liberties, no respect for the rights of others, just so long as the city runs efficiently. And a lot of people, I guess, agree with him on that. I happen not to. That's why I'm a libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
And to tie these threads together, he runs as a neoliberal. He runs as an international capitalist. So that kind of ties everything in. Anyhow, this has been Hardfire. I'm Scott Morgan. My guests have been Cathy Stewart, Joseph Dobrian. Henry Kissinger once defined economics as sheer low comedy, but I trust we've entertained you all tonight. And thank you very much for showing up.
Thanks, Scott.
Good night.
Hardfire is funded in part by the Libertarian Party of New York. www.ny.lp.org.
Have a different type of adventure and meet new people and up your sleeve? Try out delicious foods and tasty drinks in cocktails and cuisine. Experience the journey of wine and make new friends in From Grapes to Glass. And vibe to new music in Embracing the Rhythm. Pave Paradise, first Thursdays of every month, 2 p.m., Channel 35.